going through the rest of the day, and we have some very exciting sessions in store for you. And we'll start now with a presentation by Scott Stickney, who, as he describes himself, is a reporter, writer, community development assistant, marketing assistant, associate vice president of development, advertising account executive, graphic designer, and educator. In his career, Scott has worked as enrichment and career services facilitator, nurturing students' desires to learn for learning's sake, to think outside the box while learning the box. And he's taught 20 plus courses in 3 departments, spanning the age spectrum from 6th to 12th grade with many multi-age courses. And at the moment, he has the adjunct faculty position at the University of Buffalo, teaching online classes in a reboot of its gifted and talented education postgraduate certificate program. And today he will be talking about how to make project-based learning work in a hybrid environment. So thank you very much, Scott, for being with us today. And it's over to you.
Okay, thanks, Natalia. I really appreciate it. Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll go through talking about exactly what Natalia said, the idea of using project-based learning in a hybrid environment. So I'm hoping that all of you are pretty familiar with the concept of project-based learning. For the most part, when I talk with my faculty, we discuss the fact that this is a main course project, not a dessert project. A lot of us have been used to including projects in a lot of the things we teach. They're either ancillary or a little bit or smaller in respect to the rest of the unit. But when we talk about project-based learning, we're talking about something that in essence is the unit. So PBL Works, which was formerly Buck Institute, described project-based learning as students work on an extended project that engages them in addressing real-world problems or answering complex questions. So all project-based learning activities start with some questions that you expect the students to answer. They're going to do the research, they're going to create the knowledge base, and then they're going to put that together as a product or presentation that they're going to hope to make public. That could be stakeholders in your community, it could be stakeholders in your school that they're presenting to, it could be other class levels. It all depends on how you want to go about doing that. There are things to consider when we look at project-based learning, and that's key knowledge, understanding, and success skills. The project is focused on student learning goals and it includes the standards-based content, and it involves critical thinking, problem solving, communication, collaboration. For a lot of PBL, students work in small groups and the time management or self-management mode of things. There is some challenging problem or question out there that they're trying to solve. There is some kind of sustained inquiry. It is not uncommon that some of the project-based learning activities that I do could last up to 3 or 4 months, depending on what the activity might be. And then there is an authenticity to it. Natalia mentioned all the things I've done before I went into teaching, and I kind of continue to do those in my role as teacher. But having worked in business, the first thing I realized was a lot of the tasks, a lot of the tools that we were using in the classrooms did not match what students would see when they left the classroom and entered what I think we unfortunately call the real world. When they enter into the workplace or college setting, they do a lot of theory, but not a lot of practice. So authenticity is a big thing. I've given presentations in my district on student voice and choice. This is where you allow students to make decisions about the project, primarily about how they work and what they create. I'm working with a group of students right now. The end product of the project is pretty vague. It's their choice. They can really go about creating something that suits their strengths, their skill set, and something, as I say, that's in their wheelhouse, something that they would really be successful at doing. And that's from picking the topic all the way to picking the vehicle of presentation. They should be able to reflect on the work. They should be able to handle critique and revision. And then, as I said, there's a public presentation that goes along with it. This is a graphic from PBL Works. This shows kind of the cycle that we look at for teaching practices with PBL and design elements for PBL. For teachers, you're in the blue. This is the idea of how you go about. You start with design and plan, and you rotate clockwise through to engage and coach. For students, you're starting them with a challenge or problem or question, and they also follow clockwise until they get to the public product that they're going to create. I've been doing project-based learning for over 20 years. I've done billboard projects where students actually create real billboards that actually get produced and put up in our community. And the numbers in parentheses at the end are the grade levels that I worked with on those particular projects. In my Latin class, when we were trying to answer the big question of how do we know what we know about the Romans and about ancient civilizations and cultures, we did a mock archaeological dig. As World Language Department head, we created a 3-year cycle of assemblies for the entirety of the school, where we did a mock United Nations General Assembly. Every student was given a country in the UN. We brought in special language specialists from around the Pittsburgh area, and they came and did their presentations in their native language. And we had translation going on simultaneously. We've had a world language career fair where students have got to meet people who use a second language or third language in their careers. And then we have turned our auditorium into a makeshift art museum, covering art from all around the world. And students become the docents. They are teaching about the artist and the project. And you can see a list of some of the others that we've done. And you can see how they cover a wide range of topics, everything from working with another local school district on a garden, on a school garden, to building chimney swift towers for a local park, to tapping maple trees and creating maple syrup, lots of different things that we follow. So we're going to talk through some of these teaching practices, this idea of how to design and plan, align to standards, build the culture, all the way through, and try to put it into practice with something. So I have been looking at recently the idea of Japanese internment camps in the United States during World War II. And so this was the idea that I developed. How do we cover this historical content, and how do we do it in a manner that is both, that's humanities driven. So how do we connect it to English class? How do we connect it to history class? And what are our goals by teaching this subject area? And so I decided to modify this, looking at it based on the format that Wasale has when students are in session in person and when they're in session online, and how do we adjust those things? So I've come up with my 3 big questions that I want to try to answer here. And it's, what does it mean to be an outsider? I'm hoping students that by the time they end this unit will begin to see or be able to define what it means to be an outsider. And then this idea of how do we recognize and respond to injustice? So I'm hoping there will be you will notice, sorry, with both of these questions, there's something to be answered, particularly with the event of Japanese internment camps, but then we can draw that all the way to the modern day and recognize and respond to the same issues that are occurring here in 2023. It's very unfortunate that we can pick or rip from the headlines news stories that happen every day. I mean, just last week, we had a mass shooting in California here in the US at a ballroom dancing club that was frequented mostly by Asians and Asian Americans. And, you know, that brings to the forefront a very hot topic and can start to span out with this idea of injustice, how people are creating situations where somebody might still feel like an outsider. And then the idea of, by evaluating evidence, how can this bring us closer to the truth? How do we vet things? How do we look at our research to try to come up with something that's as close to the truth as possible? So the next step in creating a PBL is decide on what the major project and major product or performance the students will create and how they would go about making that public. And I tried to create a scenario here where different things could be done in different settings. So when I came up with my two examples for a project or a product, I came up with the Great Debates and the Art of Gammon. And I came up with them thinking, okay, this is a product that could be done while the students are home online, or it could be done when, say, they're together for the 3-week period, and they can come in with research done or already starting to compile research. They could know what side of the debate they're on, whether it's, do we, when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, what is, and I think I may have missed something there a second. Let me see. I wanted to point out that the reason I picked Japanese internment camps in World War II was because the topic or subject area that I wanted to cover was the results of the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So that's how that came about. So then the debate comes after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Do we inter Japanese and Japanese Americans? Some people who have no memory of ever having lived in Japan, and some who have never lived in Japan. The idea that some of the Japanese that were living in the United States were already third generation and were American citizens. So, but yet the question became, do we inter them or not inter them? So, I wanted that debate to be considered. The idea of, we're the US government, everybody plays a role, and we have a debate, sort of like a mock trial. That might be something that people are familiar with, but that would be the idea. Then there could be another debate, the concept of becoming a no-no boy. When you fill out the loyalty survey, if you answer both the no to both questions that the US government put out, you remained in the internment camps, and you pretty much got the label of being a no-no boy because you were given, you had answered no and no to both of the questions. And then the opposite of that was, if you had answered yes and yes, you were considered being admitted into the United States Army. And there was a unit called the 442 or the 442 that was almost entirely made up of Japanese Americans who had answered that they were loyal to the United States and that they would denounce all connections to Japan and that they would fight for the US, and they were put in this particular battalion. Depending on students' ability to do art and activities at home, you could consider this at home, the art of gammon, example 2. But the idea that I particularly had was that this might be something that would be used in the in-person environment. Students would work on and create Japanese-inspired arts and crafts exhibits. There is a book entitled The Art of Gammon, which looks at all the different styles of arts and crafts that the Japanese who were in the camps did to pass the time. So that would be something I think would be interesting for students to explore, because then they're getting into some very culturally specific arts and crafts. They could write memoirs as if we want to get into the creative writing aspect, pretending or creating a fictional persona of a character who is at one of the camps and telling their story. Could be poetry. There was a lot of poetry written in the camps. There was a lot of poetry written at Angel Island, just off the coast of San Francisco. That was an entry point on the west coast of the United States for a lot of Asians immigrating to the United States, like Ellis Island was on the New York side. And there's still poetry etched on the walls of what's left of that facility. And so that might be something that would be a very interesting in-person activity. Readings of memoirs and writings, reading of poetry, exhibiting arts and crafts. In our class here, I was going to be working with our 10th graders. It was a very, very small group of students. So we were going to be able to supply them all with a bonsai tree that they would then prune, and we would continually keep them on display within the school, and the kids would work through them through their final 3 years of high school and keep up with them. And then when they graduated, they'd be able to take them with them. And the other idea was either personal Zen gardens or even maybe a larger Zen garden that could be built. That would be a pretty big project-based learning activity. But these I was looking at based on the need for some social emotional learning aspect to things that are going on with students, sort of their mental well-being. And so in step 3, you map out the steps in your project, you create a calendar. So I sort of did a shell of the steps in the project, where we would use the bombing of Pearl Harbor as the entry point and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the end point, starting and ending with bombings, but obviously realizing this would branch out into a lot more questions that the students might have. Listen to some TED Talks, particularly the one from George Takei from Star Trek, who was as a youth was in one of the camps. You can find the loyalty test online. You can print that out and students can take that. There would be the history lessons involved. The English lessons involved would include the fact that there are graphic novels surrounding this, depending on reading level. There are novels, depending on reading level. There are articles that students can read. There's creative writing and creative arts that the students can look at. They can look at poetry. They can look at some of the art that has been done by people who lived in the camps. And then the other step 4, is planning activities and lessons and getting all your resources together. So hopefully I shared this presentation with Natalia and Mindy, and hopefully any of you who want access to it can be provided it. And then all of the blue are hyperlinks. So we have a TED video on the incarceration camps. Then we have George Takei's TED Talk that's available online as a resource. These are additional entries. Dorothea Lange, who worked for the Works Progress Administration here in the United States back in the 30s, covered a lot of the Great Depression, but she also covered and took photos of the Japanese incarceration camps. And there is a whole book of her photography on that. She was actually, a lot of her photos were censored by the United States government, which would lead into another sense of discussion, another area of discussion for you guys. There are lots of firsthand accounts, tours of facilities in the United States, lectures that are available. They're all there. So you guys can connect to them in that way. And then I did mark a few of the graphic novels that are available. George Takei's TED Talk has been made into a graphic novel. There's a book called Displacement by Kiku Hughes. This is a female's point of view. She sort of gets sucked back into the time of when her grandmother was in the camps, and that is a very good book as well. There are a couple books as well called Citizen 13660. That is a graphic novel as well. And then We Hereby Refuse is another one. And here are the covers of 3 of those 4, so you can see what we're talking about. And then there are a bunch of novel options. There's a very good late elementary, early middle school book called The 442, which depicts that Japanese squadron in the military. There is the famous Asian American lit piece called No No Boy. That's available. There's a memoir called Farewell Manzanar. Dan Brown, who wrote The Boys in the Boat, has a new book out called Facing the Mountain. And then there's another book called Train to Crystal City. So these are stories about people from the camps, and here you can see 442 and No No Boy. But so depending on reading level, you can really do that. The books, you could have students have the books read during online sessions, and you may have already discussed them. So when they get to the in-person settings, you can begin to work on some of the other projects. The US government, the National Park Service, has websites and articles dealing with all of the sites that were part of the Japanese internment camps. And there are different essays that have been written by scholars with different aspects. And you could always study those as well with students. And the last step in a PBL is creating what that engaging launch point is going to be for the project. And as I said, I used December 7th, 1941, bombing of Pearl Harbor. And I have some favorites that I use to get kids interested in what's going on. Before 2019, primarily I was using the attack scene from the 2001 film Pearl Harbor and the 1970 film Tora Tora Tora. But now I'm using, since 2019, I've been using Midway, which was a recreation or a reboot of a movie by the same name about the Battle of Midway. But it starts out, the opening scene of that movie is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It's very well done. And then there are documentaries that are available on YouTube as well that sort of show the attack plans and why some of the issues happened there. So there's a lot out there in the way of videos. I'm gonna push through that slide a sec. That's there if you guys want to look at it. But I did put together some additional resources This is the book that I was talking about that talks about the art that could be considered and put in. There is a organization called Facing History and Facing Ourselves, and George Takei also has a talk on there, an interview. You can find the historic blank copy of the Loyalty Pledge right there. And then here are links to all of the Japanese internment camp sites that the National Park Service has listed or has information available. So there's a lot of stuff out there that can be used. So you just have to kind of build out the plan and then make a decision on whether that, and then pick the components that you think are best suited for an online style and which ones are best suited for an in-person style. It's really up to you. I know which ones I like to do in person and which ones I would consider doing online, but it doesn't mean you have to stick with that particular format. You can manipulate things the way you see it. And there's my contact information if any of you want to get in touch with me. And thank you very much for your time and listening.
Well, thanks very much, Scott, for sharing your experience and for sharing with us this full pack ready to use for a learning project that's, and I'm sure will our teachers and those who are listening to us online and will watch the presentation later will really appreciate it. I'm just going to ask a quick question to our audience. Sure. Are there any questions to Scott? Because I actually had one as I was listening to you. I thought, there are a lot of things on the, on the borderline with other subjects at school. So when students work on a project like this, is it within your class or do they actually consult with other teachers, or are other teachers involved within a school, and how does it normally work?
We work together with other teachers in the school. So for instance, if I'm doing this, I'm making sure it's aligning with where the history or social studies teachers are in their curriculum. So we're reinforcing the concept or the subject in two different places. If it's a science or math, if it's something related to science, we try to do the same thing. Like back, if they were 8th graders, they used to have a large astronomy unit in their 8th grade science class. And when I was teaching Latin in 8th grade, we would connect the Greco-Roman constellations, how the stories behind them. That was when I would study myth with the students, because now they could tie it to, oh, why is Orion, and in the sky, or why, who's Pegasus, and then they could make connections. So even though Latin and astronomy might seem a little stretched out, they do have the connections that, we try to bring together the students and teachers as multiple resources.